the other agencies who have stayed till the wee hours of the morning. The head of the agencies are present face to face here in the session suspended. Sabihin yung maliit na ahensya nagpapadala ng mga sulat na we are on conference. I mean, kapal, di ba?
To sponsor the measure and to interpolate Wing Gatchalian.
Thank you. Mr. President, if I may please take the floor first. Mr. President, I'm ready to sponsor the budget of the Department of Education, Office of the Secretary, with total new appropriations of 676,245,962,000 pesos. Early Childhood Care and Development Council with total new appropriations of 291,798,000 pesos. National Academy of Sports with total new appropriation of 356,776,000 pesos. National Book Development Board with a total new appropriation of 121,828,000 pesos. National Council for Children's Television with a total new appropriation of 74,570,000. National Museum of the Philippines with total new appropriation of 944,407,000 pesos, and Philippine High School for the Arts with a total new appropriation of 107,171,000 pesos. As I have mentioned in my co-sponsorship speech, over the years, this is my 4th year in handling the DEPED and its attached agencies budget. It has been our goal to aim for a future-proof budget that is also sustainable, taking into account the concept of intergenerational fairness, preparing the future generation. I thank the Chair, Senator Angara, for his full support on these efforts. We are ready. The Vice President, Secretary of DepEd, SARA Duterte, is here, along with her USECs and other officers who can help this representation respond to the questions of our colleagues. It is 2:36. I will mention the time again when we are done.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, Mr. President, from the onset, let me thank the good sponsor, gentle lady from Taguig, for accepting our recommendations to the DepEd budget. We recommended 12 items to augment and to improve on the DepEd budget. Out of the 12, 8 were accepted. Some of them are the 4 that were not accepted. Some of them are admittedly quite hefty in terms of budget allocation. So this representation is willing to work with the good sponsor to look for sources of funds in order to fulfill those 4 items that I will discuss later on.
Mr. President, if I may just give a quick response, in as much as I support, usually the chairman of basic education and I are always, most of the time, are very much aligned. May I direct the attention of the good senator from Valenzuela to the person to his 5 o'clock. Yan ho ang tumatanggap ng mga amendments natin at tumatanggi. Pero as I said, we have naman din po his full support. Pero idaan nyo yung tingin niya dun sa 5 o'clock nyo bago kayo pumunta sa 6 o'clock.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So I also thank the chairman of the Finance Committee for also accepting our recommendations. I know that some of the recommendations are quite big in terms
Yes,
of value, and it's quite a challenge to shuffle around budget to look for sources of fund. And admittedly, it's a even a challenge to this representation to find sources of funds. But as much as possible, in our recommendations, we also suggest some sources of funds, and those other four recommendations that were not accepted will try to improve our recommendation as to where we can source funding for those. So again, thank you very much to the good sponsor and also to the chair of our finance committee. With that, Mr. President, I would like to also emphasize and manifest that the total allocation for the for the education sector is now pushing to 3.9% of GDP, 0.1% shy of the global recommendation of 4% to 6%. So we're now aligning to global standards. Konti na lang ho, we'll be aligned with the global standards. And I thank, again, the good sponsor and the chairman of the finance committee for prioritizing education. Education is the key to drive our economic growth. And it's been an aspiration for a very long time to hit that 4% mark. And so we're just 1.1% shy of
Yes.
hitting that global standards.
Mr. President, may I also put on record, as early as last year, the senator from Valenzuela will recall, we also had this very same discussion na malapit na tayo dun sa minimum requirement.
Yes.
Pwede naman dagdagan, ano? Yun naman ang gusto natin. And the second point I want to raise that we had also discussed that what we now need to focus on is quality. Diba? Kasi the funding is there. We have always gotten the support, most of the support, if not all. So quality naman ang kailangan bigyan ng pansin. Hindi ho ba?
Yes, definitely, Mr. President. And over the past few years, we've built a lot of the minimum requirements for education, such as classroom, hired more teachers, and definitely the challenge right now is to improve quality and to improve learner outcomes. And that it's really the ultimate mandate for the next few years. So,
And, sorry, one last thing, Mr. President. I feel it's important to mention because this goes on record, no? If I recall correctly, no less than our chairman of the Committee on Finance had also pointed out last year, and I'll bring it up now, that there's also spending that may not be reflected in this budget, like the spending of the local governments.
Yeah.
Both the gentleman from Valenzuela and I come from cities that spend a lot on education. So if we were to include all of that, at least ma-report naman natin sa buong mundo, tingin ko naman nandun na tayo sa 4% or more if we include those spendings, Your Honor.
That's absolutely correct, Mr. President. What's not recorded in this measure is the special education fund. And a lot of our cities as well as LGUs not only have their own special education fund, but they also borrow to boost education spending at the local level. In fact, in Valenzuela, we almost double our special education fund by borrowing.
Yes.
And that's an item that we haven't captured in the last few years. So hopefully, with the special education fund and with other spending of our local government, baka the 4% is actually a reality.
Yes.
So with that, Mr. President, having said that, Mr. President, since I would like to commend, of course, DepEd with the under the leadership of our Vice President for successfully opening up our schools, and Senator Pia and I are staunch advocate of going back to face classes ever since. And I commend the department for successfully returning to face classes initially. Through a voluntary basis, but after November it became mandatory, and from October to now, I would say that the recorded cases of COVID in our school is very low, very manageable, and I think what enabled that is the trial period last year. And a lot of our schools actually learned a lot from the trial period or from that period and enabled them to respond quickly. So that's that's an activity that we have to mention. And like again, I commend the DepEd for successfully bringing our kids up to school.
I must interrupt you and join you in commending the secretary, our vice president, and the team for being very firm on this. We've come a long way just because of this firm policy. And I'm sorry to add this, but unlike higher education, which we will deal with later.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, having said that, Mr. President, I know that we still have a lot of inputs that we need to resolve. No, it's no perfect picture with basic education, and with the country growing at around 6 to 7% in terms of our economic growth, and then our student population is growing around 4 to 5%. Definitely, fulfilling the inputs or the basic requirements is a challenge. And one of the things that I want to put on record, because we need to discuss this in order for our colleagues and our for future reference, and in order for us to have a target to hopefully to one day successfully fulfill this, is the requirement for classrooms, Mr. President. And I know that the amount is staggering. We've run some figures on the requirement to fulfill our requirements for classroom. But again, it's good to put this on record so that every budget deliberation, we will bear this in mind, and we will take into consideration the classroom requirements of our learners. So my first question, Mr. President, is to date, how big is our classroom shortage nationwide? And I also want to know and to inquire the amount that we need in order to fulfill the current classroom shortage and current classroom requirements, Mr. President.
Mr. President, the classroom shortage per the latest computation is 167,901 classrooms. This is based on the National School Building Inventory NSBI of 2019 for school year 2019 to 2022.
Okay. And then how much do we need, Mr. President, to fulfill all of those classrooms?
As I pick up those figures, Your Honor, let me just point out, because we may have viewers who will recall that the figure we put out during the hearings was different. It was 91,156 classrooms, but they had told us at that time that they were still updating that. So that's why this figure is now 167,000, Your Honor. The ideal budget required to, sorry. His Honor will recall that during the hearing, I presented scenarios to fill in to address the gap within 6 years during the term of this administration, and then how long it would take if we use the current budget allocated, which is 5.95 billion, and that was for the 91 billion, and not even for the latest 167, and that would take 60 years, 60 years. So sino ba Benjamin natin? Baka yun na lang yung buhay by the time na matapos yung gap na yun for the 91,000 gap. But now, Your Honor, the funding requirement to complete all construction of school buildings and repair. Iba pa rin yung number, ah. Tama ba? 755, that's different. Sabi mo 167. Here. Okay. So, for the 167,901 classroom shortage, that would require Madaming zero, give me a second. 419,752,500,000, Your Honor.
Right. Thank you, Mr. President. Our computation is about 420 billion.
The
So
same?
almost the same.
Okay.
It's actually the same, Mr. President. And I know that this is a challenge. Two challenges, actually, Mr. President. Number one is sourcing the funds. And then even though we source the fund, is also the absorptive capacity
Yes.
of building
That
these
is a big
classrooms.
problem, the absorptive capacity. Let's put that on record because kung maghahagilap tayo ng pondo, kung sa maghahagilap lang, I know our chairman can produce, but it's really the absorptive capacity. Hindi, may out ka na. It is really the absorptive capacity that is the bigger problem on how we will fund that. Kaya it's we can't even discuss that. No? It's not
Yeah.
it's not going to happen in a year, in 2 or 3 years. So that's why the chart I had prepared during the hearing gave us options on how to spread out that deficit, Your Honor, which I actually already discussed with Secretary Mina of DBM.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to put that on record so that our numbers are aligned, and then
Yes.
I think it's the challenge to this body and also the responsibility of this body to help look for that 420 billion in the next few years.
Over the years.
Over the
correct,
years,
correct.
definitely. Funding that in 1 year is close to impossible. But I think it's important to bear that in mind, so that every time we craft the budget, we can divert and allocate some amount to help close the gap of 167 classrooms that our students require. Mr. President, on the next topics on repairs, no? And we all know that our country is top 3 most vulnerable country in terms of calamities and natural disasters. And year in, year out, we would see a lot of classrooms destroyed by either earthquakes or by typhoons. Most recently is Typhoon Paeng. And Mr. President, I would like to ask also the good sponsor on how many classrooms do we need to repair to date, Mr. President?
What I have, Your Honor, the total number of damaged classrooms per year, I have a chart, and for 2022, it's actually much lower than 2021 for the information of everyone, is 5,511 classrooms for 2022. But the reason why I have a table is because even if we spend for 2022, may nasira noong 2020, may nasira
Correct.
2019, and back and all the way back to 2016. So the grand total, Your Honor, is 37,795 classrooms need to be repaired. And if I can just go ahead and tell you what the budget for this would be, it would be 45 billion pesos, Your Honor, 45.7 billion.
That's the amount we need to repair all the classroom. Madam
Based
Sponsor.
on the data that we have from 2016 to 20 damages that happened during 2016 to 2022, 37,795.
Do we have the number for classrooms damaged even beyond 2016?
This representation does not. Do you have beyond 2016 or na-lump na ba yan sa 2016?
Part of the repair that was going to part of the repair.
Much to be.
Ano? Hindi ko naintindihan. These are the repairs based on the disasters since 2016 from the various disasters. But you have another item for just regular repairs. Okay. Your Honor, did Your Honor hear that? This is just, what I'm giving is just the numbers for that represent
Yeah.
classrooms damaged due to disasters. Beyond 2016, before 2016, then that is lumped under another item, which is just yung repairs of classroom.
Okay.
Wear and tear and the ones before
Yeah.
2016.
Right.
Saan yun? Saan yung
Nag-detection, tapos nag-detection ng bakit po sir?
Mr. President, if I may just put some numbers here for clarity. For the Quick Response Fund, which would basically be used for the classrooms that are damaged, there in the NEP was 2 billion. I'm saying this by memory, no? So I will ask my team to correct me if I'm wrong. 2 billion, and then the Senate added another 2 billion, correct? So, mali. The House version was 2 billion, and then the Senate added 2 billion. So the total is 4 billion for quick response, both capital outlay and MOOE. So to be clear, yung dinagdag ng Senate is MOOE. Oh, ano ba?
For repairs. That's for repairs.
So ano na? So wala tayong dinagdag. Okay, sorry, Mr. Chairman. Since the confusion here lies with the reality that we have hearings on the budget before we get the GAB. So the House pala already added what we would have added. So from the NEP, nadagdagan ng another 2 billion ang GAB, which kineri naman natin sa Senate.
Thank you,
So
Ms.
that is for quick response. And then there is also an item on repair and rehabilitation, which is 4.73 billion, Your Honor. Tama?
Wala pa. Wala pa.
Yung mga number.
But Mr. President, from my notes and from the information that we gathered, including data from DEPED, the classrooms that we need to repair, this includes the wear and tear, as well as classrooms that were affected by typhoons and earthquakes, amounts to 413,000 classrooms. And using the benchmark of about 500,000 to repair one's classrooms, we will need 206 billion to repair. And if we include the 240 billion earlier, we will need approximately about 626 billion for new classrooms, as well as to repair old classrooms and the classrooms that were damaged recently. So I say this just to put on record and to bear in mind that the universe to just address our classroom needs, physical classroom needs, is about 626 billion, Mr. President.
Mr. President, we have different figures. So as we speak, so that we do not delay, allow me to
right.
reconcile these figures, because I agree with you. Let's put it out there so that we're clear about this. No, kasi my figures, Your Honor, are different.
Okay, Mr. President. These are the figures that we gathered, but we can reconcile it
Yes,
later on.
please.
Yeah.
Let's put it on record during the DEPED hearing at some point today, kasi mahirap naman yun na iba pa rin figures natin. No? I'm
Yeah.
sure we can. Let's do that later.
Okay,
Thank you.
Mr.
With
President.
with your indulgence.
Yes, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. So just to put that on record, and it's a challenge, and I know that it will take more than a year to find that 600 billion to fulfill all of our requirements in terms of classrooms and repairs. On the next item, Mr. President, I'll go to another topic, Mr. President.
If I may just end on that topic with, to summarize what DepEd told me during the hearings, they have made a lot of interventions, no, to come up with alternative spaces. So the number that that we were originally presented with went down because of these efforts
Yeah.
that they have made, just so that at least the public knows, no,
Yeah.
that a lot, and then the number was significant, yung bumaba po, Mr. President. I'll just have them dig it up later so I can put it on record.
Yeah. But Mr. President, another point why I raise this issue is also to look for other sources of funding. And the good sponsor pointed out correctly that the LGUs actually play a important role in terms of funding. And I remember when I was a mayor, there was this program of counterparting in which the DepEd gave 50% of the funds required for classrooms or for school buildings, and the LGU will have to come up with the other 50%. So in other words, to build one classroom, DepEd only comes up with the 50%. The other 50% comes from the local government. And that's a way of sourcing funds at the local level. No? So my point of the matter there, Mr. President, is aside from aside from the GAA, we can actually tap other sources of funds. And this calls for innovation in terms of financing, in terms of building classroom, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, on another topic, and this is a topic that's close to the heart of the good sponsor and as well as his representations. The topic of SPED.
Unahan na kita.
Yes, Mr. President. I thank the good sponsor actually for, and of course the chairman of the Finance Committee for restoring the budget and even increasing it. And this is actually a very important program, you know, considering that we have recently enacted the inclusive education law. And this funding, although I am lobbying to bring it up to 1 billion, nevertheless, the 581 million is a good number to maintain the operations of our special education or inclusive education program. So, Mr. President, just basic questions on this, Mr. President. I saw that 96 million out of the 581 million is for the conversion of 16 SPED centers into what we now call ILRC, or Inclusive Learning Resource Center, Mr. President. I would like to ask the good sponsor, how much is it to convert one SPED center to ILRC, Mr. President?
Mr. President, 8 to 10 million for the to convert a SPED center to ILRC. Mr. President, for the information of our colleagues so that they can understand our discussion, there's a maybe we can spread into the record, no, that in a school, the ideal is to have a SPED center, but the ILRC is a center where all the support services are available. Yes. So the ILRC is not a classroom, no, where teaching and learning happens, but it is a support service area where students can be assessed, allied services like physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, etc. can happen. Para lang clear, kasi yun nga, yung mga nakikinig sa atin, baka hindi nila alam yun. And on that note, I think 10 million, 8 to 10 million is the bare minimum, ano? Because if you look at the advances in science, to be able to come up with all these interventions, maliit yung 8 to 10 na yan. But we have to start somewhere.
Correct, Mr. President. And again, I thank the good sponsor for including 96 million and for the conversion. And I asked the amount because if you multiply one per region, no? So we have 16 SPED centers times 10. That's about 160 million pesos for conversion. And we're actually short by 60 million in terms of the conversion, just to hit a one per region conversion, Mr. President. And
By 60 million.
more or less about 60 million, Mr. President. So
Okay.
This representation is sincerely recommending that we increase it by the capital outlay to increase it from 96 million to 160 million just to cover a conversion per region, no? So that we will have one model of ILRC per region. Of course, if we can do more, then so much the better. But at least meron tayong one per region for the
Yes.
ILRC, Mr. President.
We agree, Your Honor, and I will join you in trying to find ways to make that happen.
And we will submit to the committee, Mr. President, some potential sources of revenue.
Wonderful.
Potential sources of funding for this, Mr. President.
Thank you.
And lastly, Mr. President, I saw in the GAB that the flexible learning, which originally amounted to 19 billion, was decreased to 4.3 billion, and it was
Yes.
scattered all over several programs. And I support this because a lot of the programs are also very important. I saw one program here, and has been a bone of contention for the last few years. This is the computerization program. Funds were allocated to the computerization program amounting to 4.2 billion.
11.36 is the increase.
And it's now about 11.36 billion in terms of budget. I support this, Mr. President. And we all know that one of the learnings from the pandemic is to invest heavily in digitization and digitalization as well as computerization. And we're miles away in terms of the ideal setup for digitalization, Mr. President, in our schools and for our learners. So with that, Mr. President, I support that. But I remember every year, Mr. President, this will be a sticking point because the disbursement rates for the computerization is quite low. In 2018, it's 13%. In 2019, it's 26%. In 2020, 28%. Year 2021 is 23%, Mr. President. So, though I support the reappropriation to the computerization program, I'd like to inquire from the good sponsor on what are the reforms that the department is undertaking in order to improve the disbursement on the computerization
In
program,
order
Mr.
to
President.
improve on
The disbursement.
the disbursement.
The utilization,
Oo.
Mr. President.
Because mababa.
Mababa siya, Mr. President. I know the good sponsor knows about this, no? Because every year we encounter this, particularly the computerization program.
Yung last one package.
O kaya nga, so is it your procurement? Is it, ano ba? Kayo ba yan? Or DBM or what?
Okay, ma'am, but it really depends on the result of the procurement.
Depends on the result of the procurement. What does that mean? Wala kayong suppliers? What does that mean? I don't understand what that means.
Sometimes, ma'am, meron talaga sa procurement ang bibig.
Wala naman yung bibig. Hindi ko yung kaya i-justify. Hindi ko yung kaya maintindihan.
Questions? Yes, Mr.
Ma'am, we're organizing po a suppliers forum so that we can know what the suppliers.
Okay.
We have that po on November 22, ma'am.
Suppliers forum. Okay. Mr. President, the response I have is this. It's a procurement problem. So I ask, what does that mean? Does that mean walang may gustong mag-offer ng service, ng product nila? I don't know what it means. So I was also told now that what they are doing to address this procurement problem is that they will have a suppliers forum so that they can hear directly from the suppliers what products are available out there. Tama? Okay. And also for the record, they are handling it themselves, no longer through PSDBM.
Thank you, Mr. President, for that information. And I support that, Mr. President. This is a recurring program of DEPED, and I think it's better that DEPED handles the procurement process. And would like to just flag the department as well as reiterating that this program for many years has low utilization rate, no? And it's important to address the issue of utilizing the budget, no? Especially for computerization and digitalization, Mr. President. So,
Yes, DepEd, narinig niyo yung concern na yan, ha? So, it's very difficult for us to justify increase in budget when the utilization is very low. So even in my own areas of particular interest, banggitin ko na yung sa ECDC, na ang baba, of course, pantay sa COVID, ganon. Pero some are able to do better eh. So we have to step it up because we won't be able to justify to DBM the request. They are nodding their heads, Your Honor,
Yeah,
that they
thank you.
recognize this problem.
thank you, Mr. President. Well, Mr. President, that's all that I have for my question. Again, I commend the good sponsor for giving this representation an opportunity to suggest and to improve some of the items in the Department of Education, most especially the inclusive education program, which is very close to everyone's heart. Again, I
Mr.
congratulate.
Chairman, just to add before you end, I know I have his honor support with the other baby of our majority floor leader and this representation, yung Doktor para sa Bayan. And to extend that, the support for allied professionals kasi the human resource needed dito sa ating SPED programs, a lot of them have very specific medical training, di ba? Yung mga PTs, OTs, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And we need to budget for them also. It will also support our
Correct.
inclusive education program, Your Honor.
Correct. It's one cycle, Mr. President, because the Dr. Para sa Bayan in turn will generate the professionals that we need for the
Yes,
inclusive
exactly.
education for
Mid-jump.
the ILRCs, Mr. President. So again, I congratulate the good sponsor and us and our Vice President for successfully opening our schools.
Students.
And a lot of our kids are now going back to school, seeing their friends, seeing their teachers, and most importantly, learning. No, so congratulations to our
Honor.
Vice President.
Yes, it's so important.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
to
Mr.
the
President.
gentleman from Valenzuela.
Yes, Mr. President, just also to put on record, we have been espousing also that landmark legislation that we passed, which is the Teacher Education Council and the special education for children with special needs. Mr. President, next to interpolate and ask questions, the distinguished minority leader, deputy minority leader, no other than the distinguished lady from Akbayan, Senator Risa Ontiveros. I move that she be recognized, Mr.
Our
President.
distinguished Deputy Minority Floor Leader, Senator Risa Ontiveros. Ma'am, mayong hapon, you are recognized.
Salamat kaayo, Mr. President. Maayong hapon po. Good Chair, may I please continue to ask some of the questions I began raising in the committee hearing and a few new ones na lumitaw mula nung hearing.
May we just get the permission of the Senate President that the deputy minority leader will face me, no? Because previously we faced, so with the
Yes,
permission.
actually, we were, during sessions, ordinary sessions, we wouldn't allow people to face their backs on the Senate President or the podium, as it is a proper tradition and protocol.
Practice, yes.
But it's okay, I'm very lenient, I'm a cowboy. I think it's easier for both to address each other this way. For this particular budget hearing, it's all right.
Thank
It's
you.
all right.
I just
Thank
wanted to be mindful, Your Honor. Thank
Yes,
you for
as
the
long as
permission.
addressed still as the President, Senate
Yes,
President. Thank you.
okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. President. And also just for the record, together with my minority leader, since the plenary interpretations of the budget of the DBCC, of the government economic managers, we have, with the indulgence of the SP and Senate and the presiding officer, been facing the chair. So
Yes, I
with
mean-
all due respect.
Yes,
to
Actually, I've
our
been very lenient. They
institution.
told me about that, our very eagle eye here. mentioned it to me, but I'm quite lenient about that, particularly during this budget season, because it's very difficult to be looking at me and addressing me and yet asking the questions to the person behind you. So for this reason, with the permission of the body, we will allow to skip this tradition for the budget season.
Make an exception
Make an
during this
exception.
budget season.
Correct.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. But at any time, the presiding officer may tell this representation to revert to our usual body language. Inanggal ko na po yung
No worries,
rotating podium na ito between the chair and the SP.
No
Salamat,
problem po.
Salamat
Please proceed,
kayo.
please proceed.
Salamat kayo, Mr. President. So, Madam Chair, I would just like to initially reiterate my earlier statement that I am one with the Department of Education in pursuing accessible, quality, and equitable basic education. I share the views expressed by various stakeholders and the public that government should spend more on our education system as an investment now and for our future. However, Madam Chair, with our economic and fiscal limitations, we can only do so much with what we have allotted for the education sector. As such, it is prudent to ensure that the department effectively and efficiently utilizes the would-be authorized budget. I hope that the DepEd family will continue to bear this in mind as I wish them a productive and meaningful 2022 National Planning Conference this week. Naway maging produktibo at makabuluhan ang inyong proseso ng pagpaplano para sa sektor ng edukasyon. At the outset, Mr. President, I thank the committee, especially the chair, for introducing amendments increasing the budgets of at least 5 attached agencies amounting to around 911.86 million pesos, so almost 1 billion pesos, and putting some funds into some of the advocacies I gladly share with the rest of the committee. I took note of and was grateful for the additional funding for teachers training on reproductive health and HIV/AIDS education, the pooling of registered guidance counselors and other school-based mental health programs, the institutional support of CSOs, NGOs engaged in the accountability monitoring of school building projects, and others. However, Madam Chair, Mr. President, I would like to follow up on some concerns I inquired about during the budget hearing last September 29. For one, the calls for the realignment of DepEd's confidential funds remain in the public discussion. I advocated then for their realignment to the IP education program, while other colleagues wanted them to be realigned to the special education program or the child protection unit. So maaari ko po bang tanungin, Mr. President, Madam Chair, kung yung said proposed confidential funds ay na-realign na nga? O may confidential fund pa rin ba ang DepEd? Kung oo, magkanong halaga at para saan po?
Your Honor, may I start with the statement of the Secretary and Vice President during the hearing that she defers to the judgment of Congress to determine what to do with the confidential funds that are found in the NEP and the GAB. On that note, when we resumed session last week, I brought this to the attention of the body in caucus for the body to determine what it would like to do with the confidential funds. And there were a number of proposals on the table. So that remains for us as a body to determine, Your Honor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. President. So sa punto pong ito, gusto ko ring i-reiterate yung sinabi ni Minority Leader kanina na na-appreciate natin yung sinabi ni Secretary VP nung hearing na nagdi-differ nga sila sa wisdom ng Kongreso tungkol both sa propriety at sa halaga ng ganong item ng confidential funds sa DepEd. And since the issue of the confidential funds were raised, the DepEd was firm in its belief that they are legal, the confidential funds are legal, and that they need the fund to protect the learners. But gaya ng napag-usapan na natin, Madam Chair, Mr. President, as expressed by the Secretary VP, they leave it to the wisdom of Congress to decide on the matter. So for the record, Madam Chair, Mr. President, I hope that our colleagues in the Senate will share the view that there are no extraordinarily compelling reasons to provide a confidential fund to the education agency. After all, Mr. President, Madam Chair, we should enable and empower school authorities to collaborate with national and local agencies to address and respond to their peace and order, law enforcement, and security needs. Mas magagamit natin ang confidential fund sa mas mahalagang prioridad para sa mga batang mag-aaral. And just for the record, Madam Chair, Mr. President, at the proper time, I will make the proper proposal regarding this realignment of DepEd's confidential funds. Dahil nabanggit ko na rin po, Madam Chair, kanina, Mr. President, na mas magagamit nga natin ang confidential funds sa mas mahalagang priority